today's video, I'm going to do kind of like a math tutorial style explanation of how you can avoid sandbag flooding in Sandbag. In other words, I'm going to be showing you some things you can do to make sure that you don't have a hand that's just sandbags. Now, I really have to end up splitting this into two categories. The first is strategy. How you actually play in the game to avoid sandbag flooding. The second is deck building. Now I'm going to leave the deck building side of this for the end of this video because I know some of you will be playing with pre-built decks, so that doesn't really apply to you. Now for strategy, I once again kind of need to end up splitting this into two more sections. Now, the reason I'm splitting this into two more sections is because there are really two parts of the strategy. First is, once again, the even more in-depth of just in-game stuff. But the other part of the strategy is your actual mulligan. So let's just start with the mulligan actually, because the mulligan is fairly simple. In the mulligan, you generally sometimes will want to have the sandbag in your hand. But what I would recommend when you mulligan is to never keep two sandbags, because that just kind of screws you over. So, in other words, lesson one is never keep two sandbags, because that will screw you over in the long run. And yeah, it's not great unless you really know that you have a use for those two sandbags. So I guess there are maybe some exceptions, like if you had like two cards in your hand that discard sandbags or something. But otherwise, there's not that much you can do. Now, for the in-game side of the strategy, I once again have to split this into two categories. So the first category I would say is the actual side of keeping track of information. So there's the information side of it, and how you respond to that information is really important. But there's also the actual like things to do no matter what. And so in terms of information, I'm going to split this into two categories. In the information, there are basically, it's all right. I'll leave that for later. In the information category, there are basically two sections. And one of them is actually not about sandbags. It's about locations. The other one is about sandbags, which is basically just so-called counting cards. You should know, and this comes back to deck building, how many sandbags are in your deck. And therefore, you're going to decide based on that what to do. You're going to keep track of this information that you might be drawing a lot more sandbags soon or a lot less sandbags soon. Based on that, it will inform your decisions. We can talk more about what you can actually do later, but you have to be aware of when it's actually very likely for you to get not only a lot of sandbags, but a lot of just useless cards in general. Now, the other thing is locations, and what's so important about locations is that your locations are what are going to allow you to consistently use sandbags. Meaning you always have to be really careful about actually having a location left to use, because if you don't have a location left to use, you will not be able to use a sandbag if your hand is just sandbags. The other thing that's really important is making sure that the locations you have left to use are actually useful. See, a lot of locations are going to be really game changing, but not necessarily utility based. And so if I have no field and no hand, no things other than just like 3 sandbags, it's not going to be useful if my last location left is, say, Bro 2, which gives extra power to soldiers. That doesn't help when I have no soldiers. It won't fix the situation. So you have to be super aware of locations. Now there's the things to do no matter what. And it's honestly kind of a lie. We are actually not going to do these things no matter what. So I'm going to introduce you to a little friend of mine that I would like to call the risk meter. And basically, this exists in any trading card game. You have a certain level of control over how much risk you are going to play with. A lot of the time, you might be playing with fairly high risk. Why? Because that just makes it seem like you're doing so much better stuff. It's so good and you're so fast and like all that. But sometimes being the most aggressive player or trying to win as fast as possible, sometimes the game isn't actually about like beating your opponent to winning. It's like about like the long-term plan, because sometimes the game isn't actually going to end up being short. And so when it comes to risk, there isn't really an optimal option. But a lot of the time, what I'm going to be talking to you about is how to reduce your risk. Because I think it's a little bit more intuitive to increase your risk. But it's less intuitive to figure out how can I actually decrease my risk. What are some things I could do to make my strategy less risky and more consistent? So that's what's going to go in this things to do no matter what, is stuff that actually reduces your risk. So the first thing is you want to always like keep creatures in your hand. And so I'm going to split this into 2 categories. Who knows, maybe I'll run a sticky notes at some point. But the first category is that rule that I like to call the ace card clause. You need to take advantage of your ability to draw 2 cards if you have 1 creature, because what that means is that as long as you're keeping a creature in your hand, you can basically get out of a bad situation where your hand is just bad cards by just drawing more cards. Once again, you have to be careful counting your cards to make sure that you know that you'll actually be able to get out of your situation by just drawing a few cards. Maybe you actually need to draw a ton of cards. Depending on how many sandbags are left in your deck, you have to think about what kind of hand you need to have at the start of your turn, because anything that's on your field is at risk of destruction, no matter what. I've played a lot of games of Sandbag. The field almost never stays intact, and having the ace card clause to back you up the moment something goes wrong is essential. Now, if we're looking at what I'd like to call the other category here, it's about actually like taking advantage of your ability to get rid of sandbags. And in other words, this is almost obvious, but use your sandbags. Sometimes, this is rare, but sometimes you'll end up in a situation where your sandbags are actually going to be used more or less depending on how much you choose to use them. And basically what I would say is, unless you're feeling very experienced or you have some risky plan that you think is really worth it, you want to take every opportunity to discard sandbags because that's what they're meant for. That's what's really good. So if a thing says discard like a card, choose to discard a sandbag, not some other card. And if you have like regular sandbags in your discard pile, which you can bounce back to your hand, don't be like preemptive about that. Like, don't bounce them to your hand just because you can. You want to wait for you to actually have something to discard them again for before you bounce them to your hand. But yeah, that might seem a little bit obvious. So anyway, these are the main things you can do in game. And the ace card clause is by far the most important one. And just keeping a hand with sandbags in it. Being careful about how fast you use your locations. Keeping track of how many sandbags you're actually going to end up getting soon. Taking every opportunity to discard the sandbags. Sometimes, actually, in terms of using sandbags, I'm almost tempted to split this into two categories, but I'm not going to because I'm literally explaining it. But sometimes you actually want to keep cards that discard a lot of cards. So if you have, for instance, Bioengineered Dinosaur, which discards 3 cards, don't be in a hurry to use that. Wait to have a lot of sandbags so that it can be a kind of opportunity to get out of that sandbag flooding. Some more advice about mulligan just while we're at it is I would generally say you actually want to put back Ricochet Railgun and even put back Shield. Because in the early game, it is your most major opportunity to not have to use ace card clause. In the later game, you're often going to be forced to use the ace card clause and or just have it be more optimal to get extra cards because you have these powerful boss cards. But in the early game, remember on your first turn, you can't ace card clause, meaning that you want your mulligan to set up for a good hand that won't need to ace card clause. Now we're here at the deck building step. For all of you who have watched all this so far and are not going to continue, thanks for watching. For those of you who are going to continue, let's split this into 2 categories. So the first category and the second category. I'm going to say for the first category, these are actually 2 mutually exclusive things, I'd say. You have to choose what type of deck you're going to build. And so there's what I'd like to call the low sandbag deck and the high sandbag deck. Now, the low sandbag deck is a deck that's built to not use many sandbags and therefore not even run many sandbags. Instead of running a lot of sandbags, you're focusing on running the best sandbags, cards like Paradigm Stardust Sandbag and Luna Masikan Sandbag. In this low sandbag deck, you want to run cards like Paradigm Y01, which are a really good location that can search out a sandbag. You want to run all sorts of other supports. You want to run some regular sandbags so that you have some consistency. You definitely want to have a good amount of draw power. And most importantly, you want to build your entire strategy. I should have been highlighting low sandbag this entire time. But anyway, you want to have a strategy that really focuses on the actual creatures in your deck instead of the sandbags. So a really good deck for low sandbag is Hacienda. You can take the Ascendant Arsenal Structure deck. It already has a great location set for low sandbags. You do have to be aware that with a low sandbag deck, you're likely to not end up being able to use your locations. But you have to look on the bright side. Not being able to use your locations isn't always a bad thing. I actually have been playing against somebody recently, one of my friends, who literally just doesn't use the locations. I'm like, bro, you need to use your locations. And that backfires on them. But they do perfectly well. And it's always a big pressure on your opponent if you aren't activating a location and they have a mutually beneficial location that they use to kind of set up. They really don't want to get out of the mutually beneficial location when you're not playing a location, because they don't want to be using so many more locations than you and getting screwed over in the late game. So low sandbag deck is actually very good for like self-control. And like I was saying, you can take the Ascendant Arsenal structure deck. It has the great location set basically. And you can just basically cut out, I'd say, probably the Ascendant Airship, because it discards 2 sandbags and wants to be having you use all your locations. That card is the main sandbag part of the Ascendant Arsenal deck. So if you just take out that card, maybe take out Ascendant Catapult, but not really that important, because you do want to still have like a card that discards sandbags. Is nice. Although honestly, I think Paradigm UFO is probably the better card there, so you can just take out the Ascendant Catapult actually. Keep the Paradigm UFO, but you can choose which one you want to take out depending on what's your preference. Put in some more creatures, just some staple creatures like it's hard. A lot of the staple creatures are already in that deck because they're machines, but probably like very old squirrel. You can run. I wouldn't recommend running more boss cards, but you get the point, right? That deck can be built to be focused on its creatures, paying all of its cost in creatures instead of paying cost in sandbags. Once you've done that, you can just run even less sandbags, put in some more creatures, and you have a really nice consistent deck. Now anyway, the high sandbag deck is a deck that runs a lot of sandbags because it's going to use a lot of sandbags. That's like Terran Transcendence, basically. But that deck honestly might even... I think, personally, I felt like that deck can be built even better, so definitely fool around with it. But, the high sandbag deck, you want to make sure that you are running a lot of cards that will get themselves onto the board, hopefully from your discard pile. So cards like Paradigm Sand Golem and Reborn Tree. You can remove a sandbag from your hand to play them from your discard pile, which then will enable you to use the Ace card clause, meaning that once you get them in your discard pile, as long as they stay there, you're never at risk of just being stuck with sandbags and not being able to do literally anything. Also, in the high sandbag deck, just like the low sandbag deck, is really important to run a lot of draw power. So I guess you could say you should just run a lot of draw power no matter what, because you want to make sure that you're drawing stuff other than just your sandbags. There's going to be a lot of dud cards in your high sandbag deck, so you want to get past them. The other thing about the high sandbag deck is that you want to make sure that you can use all those sandbags. And what's really good in high sandbag decks is to actually run cards that just discard anything. The best card, honestly, for a high sandbag deck is Bioengineered Dinosaur. That discarding 3 cards is like... It sounds like a bad thing, but it's such a good thing, because you're getting every inch of value out of the 3 cards that you discarded. Yeah, that's basically it on how to avoid sandbag flooding. Let me let me know in the comments section below what other ideas you have on how to avoid sandbag flooding. What did I miss? And is this an issue that comes up for you a lot? I know that I think it's the biggest issue with the game at all, actually. I do think it's a little bit of an issue with the game, not fully an issue with just strategy, but do tell me, does it come up a lot? I definitely think you can deck build around it, and there are, like I said, this entire tree of ways to strategize around it. But yeah, thanks for watching, and make sure to check out the rest of my channel.